Hi, Rebecca.
Hi.
Very nice to be talking to you here today, and thank you so much for making your way here. I wanted to start by talking a little bit about what you do. And I kind of want the audience to know that what Rebecca Weiner does is actually unique in the world of counterterrorism. And after 9/11, the NYPD decided to focus on terrorism. They had before, but to do it in an institutional way and to really create a space and create a profession of working both in law enforcement and intelligence within a police department. And Rebecca occupies this role now, and I just wanted you to talk a little bit about what exactly it is, and then we can talk about how unique it is.
Excellent. Thank you. It's so fun to be here talking to a good friend amidst good friends, some new, some years in the making. And first of all, I applaud everybody who has stuck with this all the way, the last panel discussion, fireside chat rather, before lunch. So we're cognizant of our place in the firmament on the schedule. But it's wonderful to be here. Thank you, Soufan Center. Thank you, State of Qatar, for everything that you have done for the conference, also for hosting one of our NYPD detectives, Vic Rosa, who is in the audience. And this just speaks to the power and importance of partnerships and why it is that the NYPD, a municipal law enforcement agency, is here in Doha at a conference which is called the Global Security Forum. So for those who are less familiar with us and our program, we are a police department who is very global in makeup, in outlook, and in impact. And that's true for the department at large. It is true for the Intel and Counterterrorism Bureau, which I have the great privilege of running now, having been a member of it for the last 17 years. The NYPD has 50,000 men and women. We hail from nearly 200 countries. There are 5,555, and I looked that up this morning, certified interpreters within the department who speak 107 languages. Extremely diverse and international makeup of our workforce. And the Intelligence and Counterterrorism Bureau leverages that international and diverse makeup in our work, which simply put is to use the power of intelligence to protect the city, whether it's by fighting crime, countering terrorism, protecting the people, the events, the spaces throughout the city. And the philosophy of the program is that we can't effectively protect our city without deeply and extensively understanding what's happening around the world, which is why we've invested so much in our relationships and our partnerships, concepts which have gotten a lot of play over the last day and a half here in this conference, which is why we have 13 cities around the world right now with NYPD officers, local law enforcement to local law enforcement, sometimes federal, sometimes embedded within international organizations, to do what we call asking the New York question. What would a particular threat, a particular incident, a particular challenge look like in New York City that's unfolding elsewhere around the world? How might some of our own experience impact the security environment favorably elsewhere, and what lessons can we draw internally? So post 9/11, we invested a lot of resources in helping the NYPD develop a capability, again, intelligence-driven, to counter terrorism at a very local level, working hand in glove with federal partners, with local partners, with international partners, but understanding the landscape in a very granular way. So a couple insights were at the backdrop of this. One is nobody knows the streets of the city better than the men and women who patrol them. Most of our workforce comes from the city itself, even though 25% of our recruits over the last almost 10 years have been foreign-born. So again, very diverse, but reflective of the city that we police. And then there's just a tremendous amount of data at our fingertips. So 3 basic pillars of our program. The collection piece, we collect information from our partners, from the public calling in leads to us, giving us information, from our own resources. We enhance it through analysis, and when I started back in 2006, I was brought on as an intelligence analyst, which was a relatively new program that was brought in based on the federal model, the federal intel community model, where you've got analysts, in this case mostly civilians, who were brought into the organization and paired up with investigators, seasoned detectives, investigators who had spent their careers on the streets. My background was more academic in the policy world, congruent with those of many of yours. And so that combination of perspective and background and experience would help us understand threats in a very new way for the NYPD. So the collection, the analysis, very much, again, modeled on the federal system. And then where we lean in very heavily is how we operationalize information and specifically how we share it. Much of our work is done at the unclassified level, although some is not. We are able to share, and we do this every day, all day, as much as we can. We've got networks of local law enforcement partners across the country, some 600, with whom we share information at a very tactical level. Our overseas partners, this is one good example, and then private sector and the public at large. So our thought is, as much as we're learning, as much as we're understanding, to the degree that we can then put that information back out into the ecosystem at large, the better off everybody is. So we've got 3 elements in the Bureau, our Intel Division and the officers assigned to the Joint Terrorism Task Force. And I want to call out, in addition to our liaison officer, Chief Bobby Rios, who commands the NYPD contingent of the JTTF, who's here in the audience with us today. Really big investment made for the last 40 years by the NYPD to the JTTF. So Intel JTTF, they're doing the detect and disrupt investigative piece, relying on human intelligence, open source intel, and then that information is then operationalized to our uniformed contingents, our Counterterrorism Division, and these are men and women who, if you've been in New York in the last years, you will have seen them deployed around the city to help protect infrastructure, to help protect people. They are specially trained, specially equipped, chem bio rad nuclear detection and mitigation, and canine and maritime and bomb squad, and a lot of the more toys element of the program, which is a counterpart to the intel piece. It's unique among local law enforcement, it's powerful, and I am extraordinarily lucky to work there.
Well, this is such a intricate world that you've talked about, but it's changed over time. We've watched the department change in terms of what it focuses on, what the intel analysts focus on over time. And so the original, momentum was how to prevent another 9/11 attack in New York. But since then, things have really changed, and the threat matrix is very different. And I wonder if you could just talk not just about the overlays of different threats that you see, how they've changed, and what the top priorities in terms of threats that are on the horizon seem to be to you in terms of the categories of what the NYPD is focusing on and what the intel analysts in particular are looking at.
So the power of the program is it's really responsive to threat and its evolution. So we built this machine over the last 23 years, and some parts of it pre-existed 9/11. In particular, the more relationship-driven parts, the dignitary protection work, the fact that we host 500 visits a year from delegations from around the world, doing all of the sharing of best practices and the good stuff that we've spent some time discussing at this conference. So that allows us to be nimble. The same tools that we use to deal with the CT threat can help us in other threats, transnational repression for one, fighting crime for another. So we're quite responsive to the evolution of the threat. And right now, and this has been talked about a bunch yesterday and today, but it's important to underline because it feels unprecedented, certainly in the last 17 years that I've been doing this work, to have this kind of everywhere, everything, all at once, whatever the movie was called, threat landscape. where instead of one dynamic rising and waning and being replaced by another, we have them all occurring at the same time, requiring us not to make the trade-offs in resource allocation that we depended on to be able to do our job effectively over the last 2 decades. So, we still have the core threats. We always have, but we have them with renewed energy and vigor and urgency over the last few months, in particular, of an externally directed foreign terrorist organization threat. And I'm thinking in particular of ISIS-K, about which we've talked a lot. We have newly emboldened nation-state threats. And John Miller mentioned this yesterday, but notable that Iranian government tried to assassinate a women's rights activist in New York City 2 summers ago, a threat stream which is really important and not something we contended with in this way in the early post 9/11 era. External, the homegrown threat, which we've dealt with a lot, especially in New York City. We've had 60 plots and attacks directed against the city since 9/11. Many of them were in the category of homegrown violent extremism, the lone actor threat. Certainly that threat elevated substantially post October 7th and the mobilization to violence that we see emanating from just an overall heightened threat environment worldwide. And then also the accelerationist, white supremacist threat that was embodied perfectly, horribly, 2 Mays ago at the Buffalo Tops supermarket mass shooting by Peyton Gendron. All right, so there's that. And then the corollary to that would be the anti-government anarchist threat, which waxes and wanes in New York City, and it's now in the waxing period. And this is animated by real distrust in lack of faith in institutions, in particular government institutions, and in particular police as the embodiment of government institution. And an alarming trend that we've been experiencing over the last couple years has been people who are committing acts of violence motivated by conspiracy theory. And this was made very palpable to us January of 2022 when 2 of our officers were killed responding to a domestic violence call by somebody who had been consuming great amounts of conspiracy theory by a shooting of 10 people on a subway a few months later. And interestingly enough, the first few days of the Trump trial, which is ongoing, a man walks into Collect Pond Park, which is right across from the courthouse, and douses himself with gasoline and sets himself on fire and self-immolates and dies. Thankfully, didn't affect anyone else. Mental health, but also conspiracy theory. So that's a new vector for us to contend with. And then, of course, there are all of the other issues that we deal with that compound these threats. And I think that's a really important point. It's not just that we have this array, this salad bar of issues, they're all popping off at once in various ways, but they do compound one another in ways that we don't entirely anticipate. So you've got all of these drivers of instability that we've been talking about around governance or climate change that drive migration. We had 2.5 million people cross over the southern border, have encounters at the southwest border last year. So the climate change nexus to migration issue, we've had 200,000 people come into New York City seeking shelter over the last 2 years. That, of course, then becomes a vector of some real issues, and in particular, driving the white nationalist accelerationist threat that I mentioned earlier. So these things are simultaneous, but they are not just coincident, they compound each other, and it makes things really challenging for us.
You know, this is something that political scientists have given a term to of late, and they call it polycrisis. And the essence of it is that you really can't distinguish these, whether it's issues that result from climate change, from migration, from terrorism, whatever it is, that they all sort of overlap, and that you really can't understand one sector without understanding the whole.
No, but you have to respond to all of them collectively.
Right. So in your opening remarks, you mentioned working with the private sector. And actually, that's a really interesting part of how law enforcement works with the private sector, and particularly in the areas of technology, where the private sector has become so fast-paced and oftentimes outpacing the government in terms of what it can do, what it can provide. But on the other hand, that's a very difficult thing to do, right? Because, as you said, your intel analysts are civilians, your private sector is civilians. Describe that relationship, how you think about it, and I'm assuming this is not just domestic private sector, but international, because so many of these entities have an international presence. So just how you think about that and how that works within the mindset of what you do.
Well, so there's the public, and there's the private sector, and then there's the law enforcement egress into private sector, which is kind of a bridge between the two. And I think that is really important. You know, we have talked about partnership and the importance of it, and that it isn't really just about having formal relationships. But at this point in our maturation as a program, as a department, and as leaders, we've all grown up together. We've grown up working together, and then your brothers and sisters who you've grown up with from different agencies, from your own agency, retire, and they go off to these new jobs, and they transport those relationships, and that's just kind of humanity in the workforce, ideally. But what's happening now, which I think is great, is that a lot of the intelligence supremacy, information supremacy that was the government's for many decades, because the government had all the secrets, and the private sector was kind of a barnacle on the government machine helping do the R&D. That's gone now. And the private sector is as likely to provide us intel, to provide us helpful information that we can use to help protect the city as our own resources are. And that's true at the level of local law enforcement. That's true in the federal world too. And that's true for all the reasons that you might think, and partly it's the way technology works, partly it's the amount of information that is openly available. So the journalists in the room are doing a very similar job as my intel analysts are. They are mining through just mounds and mounds and cacophonous noise of information online and finding a whole lot of signal. So anyone who isn't working with private sector is not actually understanding any kind of threat or challenge at its root and at its source. In the cyber domain, this is particularly true, but it's not just the cyber domain. If you think back of the drivers of threat over the last several years, they are as likely to impact the private sector as they are government. I mean, unfortunately, Crocus City is a terrible reminder. It's not just about securing infrastructure, it's about making sure that intelligence is getting to the hands of the people that can operationalize it to protect whatever the locality is. So need to make sure that we're sharing information, but also need to appreciate the amount of information that can be shared back.
Yeah, I want to turn a little bit to terrorism and counterterrorism. So in all of this analysis of open source and also classified information, how has the terrorism threat changed over time? And I'm particularly thinking about not just what areas of the world and what new groups, but I'm really thinking about the youth factor. What is the younger generation? How is the younger generation of those who identify or are identified as terrorists different, or is it different from, you know, the Al-Qaeda generation that brought about 9/11? And remember that this is something I was reminded of this morning by Noreen Fink, that bin Laden had said, you know, who are these young guys? They don't know what they're doing. They, you know, so how has the terrorism threat changed with this newer generation?
I think at a certain point in your career, you begin saying things like, oh my gosh, look at the kids these days. And I wonder if that says as much about the threat landscape as it does about us, our own existence within it. But it is true that we are seeing younger and younger people mobilizing toward violence. And again, it's across the spectrum, and it's teens, and it's young teens. And it's not just in the counterterrorism arena, it's also in the crime fighting sphere. Younger and younger people are drawn into gun violence. And the pandemic is a big cause of it, and the online environment is another big cause of it. The gaming community, and I don't want to single out gaming community for anyone who might be a big investor in video gaming, but I do think that there is a sense of alienation, loneliness, and real despair and mental health crisis among younger people that is playing out at the level of violence and mobilization to violence. Really scary, if you want to read a really scary article in Vice magazine around a group called 764, which is a cult, but also accelerationist in tenor and in impact of really young kids who are victimizing other young kids and doing a variety of horrific tactics in the bullying to forced suicide realm, digitally driven. And that shows you how youth radicalization to violence and self-harm can play out in one sphere. In another sphere, you look at people who are consuming a lot of ISIS propaganda, who are mobilizing to, and look what happened in Australia, a few weeks ago, where you had a teenager stab a Coptic priest in Sydney, Australia. These individuals, we might describe them as lone actors. They're usually not. They're usually part of online communities of like-minded people. So the youth are telling us something. They're telling us something that we have to listen to very carefully and closely, because Christy Abizaid said this well yesterday, we are talking about generational shifts in the terrorism environment. And she was referencing post-October 7th and the war in Gaza, which is a big deal, certainly in this regard. But before October 7th, we were already seeing the transition to younger threat actors, and that creates challenges. It certainly creates challenges for our federal counterparts. It's hard to prosecute somebody who's 13, 14 years old. It's not easy for local law enforcement either. But we're going to have to think really hard and really quick about what to do about this problem, because it is not going away.
Let's talk a little bit about disinformation. You sort of referenced it without using the term in your opening remarks. So in all this open source intelligence, OSINT, which has become so important to the work that you and others do, what are the skills that you've learned to figure out or to analyze or to at least raise a question about information, and what do you do to find out if that's real? And just so further, are there lessons in that for the society at large? Are there things you're learning out about disinformation that you could share with the rest of us, so maybe we could be a little more savvy?
So we could solve all the problems.
Yeah.
We'll do it really quickly before the presidential election.
Yep.
Tsunami of disinformation that's about to engulf us all. And one can be really catastrophist about it, and I am much of the time. But then I think the great hope, and somebody said this yesterday, is that maybe we're going to be so discouraged by not knowing if things are true or not online that we will remember that there was a time in our lives where we didn't spend our whole lives online, and we will leave TikTok, and we will leave Instagram, and we will leave all the other platforms behind, and we will start talking to each other face to face, just like the old days. So there might be the apparatus starts eating itself, and that's the silver lining of the disinformation universe. But I think what our children are learning in school, I hope, is information literacy, which is something that we all haven't really been learning. We're learning it the hard way by consuming it, by being seduced by the falseness, by the polarization into some really horrible outcomes. So I hope that our kids are going to be smarter about how to check their sources and make sure that they are relying on stuff that is reliable. We need to be doing a better job, far better job of this at all levels. I think that the act of being a conscientious journalist or a conscientious intelligence analyst or officer is about making sure you're corroborating and you're checking. That becomes hard to do, but it becomes important. And I think we all sort of know how to do it. We just didn't know that we had to in the way that we have to. And now, of course, it's a clarion call for everybody around the world. But I will say, I mean, as somebody who has spent a lot of time looking for generative AI artifacts online, and in particular those that help you make bombs or provide recipes for nerve agent or just give really compelling deep fakes that are focusing on radicalizing people toward violence or voting in a particular way or other myriad threats, it's really hard to do.
Let's talk about elections. You raised elections, and we have an election coming up, I've heard, in a few months. And so, is there anything new that you've designed as a police department? I mean, there are elections, important elections going on in over 50 countries around the world this year, something the Soufan Center has been producing reports on. What's new? Is it just same old, protect the polls, or is there's some added, program to respond to the urgency that we now see in terms of election insecurity?
I think we're starting not just the conversation, but the planning, interagency planning for how to make sure that we're protecting the election from now till the actual day of voting in a much more concerted fashion. And there's different threats that will be at issue at various moments from here to there, right? There's the day of threats, which would be where you would have the physical violence threat, the swatting, the leads, all of the events that we anticipate and preparing for. And then there's, of course, the cyber environment, which will be seasoned throughout until November. But I have not seen this level of dedicated planning and concerted thought around elections. We did a lot of it in 2020, so that was a good dry run, and everybody expects this to be even more intense. All of the work that we've been doing, all of the relationships and the collaboration we've grown for the last 23 years come into play now to help deal with this, and talking to the people who are really steeped in the guts of what's been happening. I think there's a lot of confidence that we're going to be able to have a free and fair election, but the fact that we have to assert that is just crazy in and of itself.
Okay. Couple more questions. I see we're short on time. When you think about the past 17 years, what lessons have you learned that we're not going to do that anymore? No, that doesn't work. Or that idea of thinking or that understanding of a threat, that's just not right. What have you learned that sort of we left that behind and sort of moved into a new way of thinking about terrorism, violence, et cetera?
Well, I mean, I could spend hours, and you all would be very grumpy and tired and hungry, talking about things that we've learned, because we change everything. We change all the time. Some of it is tactical, programmatic. We developed an entire operational response capability, the Critical Response Command, after the France attacks, the ISIS attacks in France in 2015. Our active shooter scenario developed in the post-Mumbai context, changed again in 2015. Programs are developed based on lessons we learn and our partners learn. One of the things that I think threads through a lot of our programmatic change is the importance of being transparent, which is not obvious if your work is in intel. And I think it's anathema in the early post 9/11 years and pre 9/11 to really lean into being as transparent as we can and as communicative as we can, knowing that people are going to have really strong opinions about what we do. Some positive, some negative, and yet that is, I think, one of the more important requirements to be an effective participant in the hard job of keeping a city safe, is telling people what you know, what you don't, leading to the ability to actually have some degree of public trust. And, I know we are running short on time, but I just think it's important to emphasize. I don't know it's hard to see anybody's hands, but how many in the audience are police or who have done policing in your past? A couple, not too many. Policing as a discipline has had a really hard few years, and many disciplines have, but I think it's important to underline. This is a really hard job. It's a hard job because you're engaging with the public every day. You're engaging with people at their personal nadirs, their moments of crisis. And it is a job that requires public trust, but that isn't built necessarily to build it on its own, right? And so we really have to double down on how we engage with community and on how community think of police at a moment in time where people are just not interested in institutions and they are feeling very against systems. And we unfortunately bear some of the brunt of that. So how to navigate that environment effectively and maintain the morale of our workforce who spends all of their day doing this hard work, that's a challenge that we get better at, hopefully, every day.
Yeah, and that's actually very important because the municipal level, the city level, overcoming that issue of community interrelations, and particularly when it comes to the legitimacy of institutions, is something that states are struggling with, governments are struggling with, intergovernmental institutions are struggling with. So we'll leave it to you to figure out how to do it on the municipal level, and then we can kick it up.
By next year,
we'll have it all worked out.
We'll all be talking about how we've solved all the problems of this year.
Rebecca Weiner, thank you so much for coming to here today, and thank you all for being here.
It's my pleasure.